So welcome to everyone. I think I know everybody here more or less, but my name's Christina Hartley. I'm the director here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. Welcome to Harriet Beecher Stowe House Semicolon Club Online. We are definitely happy to have you here to discuss this book, Girl in Black and White. And our sponsor for the Semicolon Club this year is Donna's Fabulous Faux Furs. We're excited because we getting sponsors for things is not something that we've been able to do much of in the past, and we're excited about doing more of that kind of thing. But we want to thank them for their contributions to us. And then our host for today's discussion is Ann Buening. And Ann is a board member here at the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House and a longtime volunteer docent and one of the primary people who works on our exhibits. So I will let Ann start our discussion and take it away.
Okay, well, as Christina has said, welcome to this month's Semicolon Club. And I hope you all found the book as fascinating as I did. It's certainly a strange instance where truth is stranger than fiction. The first half of the book, you're just kind of reading it, you're going, oh my God, this can't be real. This is so bizarre. From the whole situation of Mary's family, what her father had to go through in order to obtain his own freedom, and then his family's freedom, and then the people who ended up owning Mary's family, one of whom was himself half Black as well. So it's this really kind of odd situation that as Sumner at one point in the book, she makes a quote where he talks about you can no longer use the distinctions of race to discuss slavery. Of course, he meant it in the fact that there were children who were quote unquote pure white looking, even though they might have had like a drop of African blood in their DNA, or the whole way of thinking about it. I found truly amazing myself, because it's not how you're used to thinking about slavery in a way. And anyone, please feel free to jump in. This is a discussion, it's not a lecture. And I would love to hear what you all thought about the book as well. But for me especially, I was really fascinated by the book because it's a lot of what it discusses is about the visuals of slavery. And what I do for a living is I actually work in the curatorial department at the Cincinnati Art Museum. And we're the ones who write the labels on the paintings when you go see the galleries, and we get to pick and choose what paintings are up there. And so it really kind of made me think about the art museum's collection and how do we perceive slavery or Black people in our galleries. And actually there might be an exhibition kind of like budding in the back of my brain, so we might actually see it in reality in a couple of years, because it does take a couple of years for exhibitions to be planned and put up. But I wanted to share this picture, and I apologize because I can only get a really, really bad, let's see here. Can I share screen? Here it is. It's a bad JPEG of a painting by, okay, can everyone see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is by actually a Jewish artist named Henry Mosler, and it's called the Quadrion Girl. And he painted this in, let's see, where are my notes, in 1878. So this was actually done years after the 13th Amendment that gave freedom to all the enslaved people. And he painted it actually inspired by a poem called The Quadrion Girl by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And the poem, I'm not going to read it because it's a bit long to read, but basically the whole point of the poem is this girl is actually sold by her father, who is also her master, to a slave dealer. And the last two stanzas where he talks about, so the farmer is hard on his luck, he needs money. And so he's, let's see here, his heart within him was at strife with such accursed gains, for he knew whose passions gave her life, whose blood ran in her veins. But the voice of nature was too weak. He took the glittering gold. Then pale as death grew the maiden's cheek, her hands as icy cold. The slaver led her from the door. He led her by the hand to be his slave and paramour in a strange and distant land. And so it's really kind of, again, where in the book they talk about how a lot of people didn't want to talk about the sexual nature of slavery, which is why they're like, for as much as they talk about Mary looking so white that she could, you know, quote unquote pass, is that, and everyone's like, well, this is obviously the blatant visuals and evidence that masters were basically using their women slaves for their own personal satisfactions. And it was, and when she talks about it being an obsession among white people that was not really discussed, it really kind of was, as this painting shows, where it was painted so many years after the fact, when people were freed. So it was very much, I don't know, for me, I keep seeing it in this broader context, but I'm also kind of rambling. And let's see here, let me stop the share so I can see you all again. There we go. So this is a discussion that even to this day, a lot of people don't really talk about within the general context of our way of not dealing with slavery, and how we perceive slaves. And so it's quite an interesting way to look at things. Did anyone else feel this when they read the book, or were you responding to different things when you were reading it?
I can hop in here, and I apologize that my camera is off. I really wanted to be here today, but I'm also at my son's baseball game. So I'm tucked away in the car where I can see the field. And anyway, sorry. But I love the picture you brought in and the poem from Longfellow. And I think to get to your question about like what stood out to me, it wasn't necessarily the visual history, because I don't have that rich context that you have, but just the complexity of some of these families getting ripped apart and all of the like interdynamics among these families and the wills. And I just admired the writer so much for going back and trying to trace out and in how convoluted her story was, as you kind of got at. You're just like, man, this is just like a hugely complex situation, slavery. And also people are trying to push for change using visuals that are participating in complicated discourses. And I loved the part about the picture, and like the way that the taking of the photograph and the way it was distributed reflected so much about where the technology was at that time. And that just made me think about how images are used today and how they're circulating, and the way that the technology combines with the message, with the actual physical object, to create circulation and like publics that respond to that in different ways. And the whole idea of connecting her photograph to Ida May as like this fictional character. Well, let's just capitalize on the fictional character, and that can be this discourse that this child, this real child, kind of steps into. I just thought that was really interesting as well.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, Mary herself and the public just became lost, where she became that fictional character. It was like there was no line between the two of them. Mm-hmm. And I liked how the author pointed out when she was finding photographs, various copies of the photograph, like a lot of them were actually labeled Ida May, as if she was real. And again, it's like you touched also on the use of images as political things, and that's always been the case. But yeah, for the first time, having photography in the United States, this is one of the earliest uses of photography to make a political point, which hadn't really been done up until that point. I mean, well, so the picture was taken in what, 1855, and photography itself was first introduced into the United States in 1839. So it was a brand new technology when all this was going down. And it wasn't really until the Civil War that you had all these soldiers getting their pictures taken that you see photography become even a slightly common thing for families to have.
Right. So that what kind of brings it to full circle in terms of that is I overheard my 8th grade stepson talking the other day. He was in the other room. He was like, yeah, I was taking this history test and they asked what photographer was important in the Civil War. And he's like, I didn't know. And I yell out from the other room, Matthew Brady. And he's like, who cares? And then, so then I had to explain to him how, you know, this is really the birth of photography. And prior to that, you had to go to a studio and sit down and have your picture taken. And it was a big deal. But Matthew Brady brought the camera to the battlefield and you actually saw what was happening. So really these ideas of pictures and you know, the public now sees what happens on a battlefield. And that's a big disconnect from, you know, oh yeah, there's a battle going on, to the images of the aftermath of that. And so this really kind of speaks to that as well in terms of, you know, photography as a form, as a, you know, a record of people's lives. You know, you have to go to the studio, you sit down, you get your picture taken, but this plays into that because her picture was taken for a very specific reason and it was meant to show a very specific thing. And you don't get, you know, you might say, oh, there's this little girl that looks white, but she was born as an enslaved person. You might have an image of that in your mind, but is that the same image as the real image? So this whole idea of photography being used as a form of record really starts in this time period.
I thought one of the things that really struck me was the fact that they talked about a white girl having been taken into slavery, and all of a sudden here we have this little girl who looks white, but a white child had been found in slavery, and parents now reacting in such a different way because, oh my goodness, could they take my child and sell her into slavery even though she's white, because maybe she's not as white as even the child that we're looking at here, the Ida May character, or the little girl, you know, that's assumed the Ida May character. So I think really that made a big difference with people, because it could be their child. And that they, even though it was a rare circumstance, that really hit home for a lot of people. And it was interesting because with the picture, they were able to see, well, this child is lighter than my child. And with them taking them around, and when he did, I thought it was awful, but when he put the kids on stage and said, pick out which one was black, that was horrible, but they picked the wrong child. And then the parents were so upset, but, you know, he made his point, although I wasn't feeling that it was very humane. So.
Yeah, a lot of this book where you can feel like they had good intentions, but went about it in the wrong way. I mean, and the whole thing with Thomas Wentworth Higginson, where he wanted to adopt her and he just assumes that her family, who has fought so hard to come together and like went through all these like literal trials and tribulations, and her father raising most of the money himself to free his own family. And then that just got totally lost by the press because they're like, oh, it was the white lawyer or the white senator who got the freedom for the family. And so it really kind of lost that key aspect of what her father was trying to do to keep his family together. And then you have this guy come in who's just like, oh, you can't take care of her. I want to adopt her and only her and none of your other children. And then he goes off and arranges her to get sent to some like posh academy for a year, but not the other two children, where you're just kind of like, how did that feel in the family, where like Mary got the special attention and everyone else was just kind of like, oh, you're not anything important. I mean, it's what they did to this family who fought so hard to stay together and then try in different ways to separate them, was one of the more horrifying aspects of the book that really stays with me.
Yeah, one thing that it made me think about, like with the invention of photography, and when I found out we were reading a book, like I was so excited, and then I kind of ruined the book for myself because I like to look up interviews of the authors, and so, but she's a photographer, and she wanted to talk about like photographic theory, and I was like, oh my God, that sounds so boring. And but you know, it's like her thing, right? Because she's originally a photographer. But in reading the book and just seeing like how, you know, how this picture was used, it made me think of like, so like it was so new. It makes me think of like cell phone cameras and how videos that we take, you know, with anything, if it's a crime, you know, police shooting or police assault, you know, how that video can be used. We just had a terrible incident here in Columbus, you know, and then there's video of that. But that wasn't a cell phone. But, you know, cell phone cameras, you know, with George Floyd. So it's right. It's like this whole, it's like, wow, like you can actually get a picture. So I'm glad that she, you know, did care that much about photography to, like, you know, I thought, oh, okay, I can see why this is more of a big deal. Imagine if before, you know, you would just have to sit there and get your picture painted, I guess. Like, you know, like if you wanted your picture, you'd have to get it painted. But now you can just take this picture. And now we have cell phone cameras that are making people more aware, because now it's, you know, in moving in real time. So that's all.
Yeah. I have two comments I'd like to say to add to that. One is that a book I read several years ago was called No Caption Needed. And it is like unabashedly exactly what you're describing. It's like the sort of like history of the use of photographs rhetorically. And then it does all these different case studies of images and how they circulate. So I think I was actually opposite from you. I was like primed for this book for that reason. I was like ready for it. But it really made me think about also, to Christina's earlier point, how different this photograph and the way it was used is from the other ways that I've heard the early days of photography talked about. Like, I feel like I've heard people say, oh, are there ghosts? And there was that whole thing about, can you take a picture of Mary Todd Lincoln and do you see Abraham Lincoln's shadow behind her or whatever? And that was this whole discussion about, you know, the paranormal in photography. And then also the photographs on the Civil War battlefield, which, you know, seem like it's this early form of sort of photojournalism. But this is something I think distinct in that it's a photograph taken with the express purpose of it acting like a speech in a political context. And I just was like very intrigued, just the way that the whole image was manufactured with that intent. And it worked, you know?
Yeah, but also too, what I find really interesting is the fact where Sumner himself, from almost the very beginning, said, I wanted to use this girl for political reasons because he knew white audiences up in North would care more about her than all the other children who are also enslaved. And I also thought it was interesting in that one section from the Ida May novel that she quotes in her book where it talks about the other Black children who get one line.
Yes.
And then are totally ignored for the rest of like whatever, how many hundreds of pages in the book. And it's just kind of this whole idea where people were caring about slavery, but their own concept of slavery, like they didn't understand what it actually meant. And then also at the same time, I mean, even Higginson himself, like when he was in charge of, you know, all the colored troops in the Civil War, where he was just like treating them as if they were these children, and they weren't, and where he himself couldn't get past his own racial prejudices. And anthropologists for decades had been big in the whole conversation of what is the reason that we're enslaving people of a certain color over others, and also using it as kind of like their, and that in turn was used by culture in general as like, oh, this is why we can go in and take over as colonizers, because obviously you don't know what you're doing. And I was trying to find it because I have this, my background's actually in anthropology is what I majored in school. And I have this old textbook from the University of Cincinnati that was published in 1913. And the very first page of it, which is why I was trying to find it, and I'm really annoyed that I can't, because it literally says, this is how things are. Whites are on top because we're the smartest, our brains are the most developed, and it goes all the way down the line, ending, of course, this is from 1913 with what it calls the Negroes. And so, and it's this like black and white, very first sentence of the very first paragraph on page 1 that is discussing this. And then that's the whole setup for the rest of the book. And this ideology was something that had been repeated for hundreds of years. And that really kind of played into what Sumner was doing, and what Higginson was doing. I mean, like they saw the atrocities of the system, but at the same time, they couldn't fully recognize the full personhood of the people that they're trying to free. And the use of Mary as an illustration of that really was kind of interesting. And so that one quote on, at one point where Sumner is giving a speech, and then the New York Daily Times is talking about it, and they claim that Mary was so white as to defy the acutest judge to detect in her features, complexion, hair, and general appearance the slightest trace of her Negro blood. And then the author goes on, if racial markers could not provide proof of free status or correctly identify a girl of African or German or as lawfully marriageable or no, then how precarious, how absurd it was to have race be the sole basis for the entire system of exploitative labor. And that I really found fascinating myself, especially when you look at it in this broader context of what was going on. And there's just, oh gosh, I mean, this book, you could do a whole entire, I feel like, course on historical slavery and the systems based around it. And I see Amy just brought up, is that social Darwinism? To an extent, yes, but that social Darwinism actually didn't come out as an idea until the 1880s. So this idea was always there. I mean, well, I think, what was it? The Origin of Species was written in 1869, and then social Darwinism came out, actually not by Darwin. It was an anthropologist, actually, who kind of took up the ideas of what Darwin was saying and applied it to cultures, and that's what became social Darwinism. They've already had it for years. They just suddenly gave it a name. But yeah, so there's this overlaying sense of that people really can't shake their own backgrounds and their own like personal cultural beliefs and how they view people. And so much of what is discussed in this book, I feel you could literally talk about it today with so many real current and contemporary examples. And especially within the context of this whole past summer with the Black Lives Matter movement coming to the fore. And I hate that we have to keep coming back to this, that it's something that it like rears up its head and then like politicians promise to do things and then manage to not, and then we have to go through all this all over again. And even in the midst of all this, as what Amber said before, is like we're still hearing about all these unnecessary deaths that are keep coming up, and especially what just happened in Columbus, and it's like Ohio needs to stay out of the news. We've got too much bad stuff going on that keeps popping up. But yeah, so it's yeah, the whole thing, it's you can't just say, oh, this happened in the 1850s, we'll never see it again. Which is really a shame, that we have to think about it this way. Not to call out any names, but does anyone who hasn't like spoken yet feel like they want to say something? Or I would love to hear from someone who hasn't spoken yet. I mean, because we've only been at this for half an hour, but I just feel like I don't want to lecture either. I do want this to be a discussion. Was there any point about the book that I've not talked about, or Amber or Kelly or Christina haven't talked about, that really stuck out for anyone else who read it?
Well, I like how
some apologize. I haven't actually read the book yet. I logged in to listen to the discussion so that when I do get a chance to read it, I'll have some other perspective in my mind about it. So.
Oh yeah, it's a fascinating book. It's well worth the read. And Shelley, you were going to say something too.
Yeah, well, I just found it interesting that they talk about Theodore Weld and Angelina Grimke in the book, which is really relevant to the Harriet Beecher Stowe house. So I liked how there was like a connection there that like you just you wouldn't have noticed really.
Yeah, and that really kind of became like a throwaway line in the book in a way, where it's like, oh yeah, there were these other people who were kind of dealing with slavery issues, and for us especially, yeah, those names really would kind of be like, woo, we know that. Yeah, no, so you were able to kind of like bring in like, oh yeah, we were still connected to this in a lot of ways. Let's see here. Oh, Tony, did you want to say something too?
Yes. The more I read as I was reading the book, it was just so male dominated. And, it's, even though I know women had to be aware of what was going on during slavery, to me, it is so amazing that the women would knowingly go along with their husbands having affairs with the slave women. And they had to know it. It couldn't be a secret, because how did these children come about that were white when they were the only white people on the plantation? Because often the overseers were Black too.
Yes, and she does kind of talk about that with the man who was Mary's grandfather, the lawyer, how he also had a white wife. And in the end, he still had this whole separate family on the side as well. And yeah, it's just like this whole like culture of complacency, I guess you could call it, amongst women, where, I mean, what option did they have really in the end? Because they didn't have any legal recourse themselves. Once they were married, they were essentially, everything they were was taken over by their husband. So I don't know how much they really could have said anything in retaliation against that.
Although I really wonder, I mean, there's a point where humanity's humanity. And, I've not gone through my total roots, but I know on one side of my family, there are plantations involved and there were slaves involved. And as a young child, I met children that had been, their parents had been slaves. And my grandfather had played with them as little kids because his father and grandfather owned the plantation. And my grandfather was very old. I mean, he was almost 100 when I was 20. So, and they had a relationship still where they saw each other several times a year. But humanity's humanity, and either, there is at some point where you have to realize, you can't just excuse it. I mean, I know it was the times, and I know that we all, participated indirectly, but yeah, you just look at it like, how could you treat an animal like that, you know, and to treat humans, which even if they didn't think they were totally human, they were told that they were animals. It just didn't make sense sometimes when you read, the more you read about it, it doesn't make sense how everybody can look away and say, oh, it doesn't impact me. Especially the Northerners, I think. The Southerners knew what was going on, but the Northerners just to look away and say, it didn't impact me.
Amy, did you want to say something?
Well, first I have to apologize because like Marty, I didn't get a chance to finish reading the entire book. I've read some sections, so I apologize, but I wanted to come and hear the discussion anyway, so I'm not trying to derail the conversation about the book. I just wanted to say that some of today's conversation sort of reminds me of, I don't know if anyone else watches Finding Your Roots, but it's one of my favorite shows to watch because I'm that girl on PBS. But when they go through people's lineage and you find out that certain people who are based only on appearance, you wouldn't think are related, but when they do the genetic testing to find out that, you know, completely seemingly visually unrelated people are totally genetically related, it's fascinating. And, you know, just goes to kind of Tony's point about the interconnectivity of sort of more people than we realize in the American landscape. But one of the things I'm struggling with, which is why I think these book discussions and you know, that the Stowe House is doing are helpful, is just like Tony was kind of touching on. It's so hard to put in context with our 20th century sensibilities, and yet at the same time, we still see these things playing out, like Anne was saying, over and over and over again, with like Micaiah up in Columbus. You know, not to again take us away from the book, but there's been quite a number of social justice commentary on the fact that if Micaiah's complexion were different, I think that's how it's pronounced, that the police might not have resorted to shooting first and asking questions later. Because yes, they walked into something they didn't know what it was, but they shot first. And now a 16-year-old child is lost to her family because these patterns just keep repeating even in current day. And it's just unsettling is not the word. I don't even have a good word, because we think, oh, this happened in the past and we're over it and we're past it, but we're not, you know?
Yeah, and well, when I give tours at the Stowe House and I talk about the things that were happening back then in terms of politics and slavery and what was happening here, even in Cincinnati, and especially when I talk about the race riots that started in our city in 1836, and then we had the one in, oh gosh, what is it, 2000? I was actually out of state living in Colorado in college at that time as an undergrad, and everyone was coming up to me because they knew I was from Cincinnati, and they're like, what is going on in your hometown? And I'm like, that's a discussion we need to sit down over a beer and just really discuss and be honest about it, because we're still to this day dealing with the exact same thing. Like, we have not gotten our acts together, I guess you could say, in some ways, or we're not willing to deal with it, and so we just keep repressing it, and then we're experiencing it over and over again. I mean, as the saying goes, history does repeat itself. And it's horrible that we still have to have these conversations. Tony, did you want to add another comment?
Yeah, oh, I love that you brought up Roots, because I was watching it last night and it hit me too, because Don Lemon was on, and you know, he looks African American, but he's, you know, he has white roots, and they were telling him how much, you know, a very large portion of his heredity was European. And yet his family had been held in slavery, and this had been done, you know, the sexuality and all that had been done to his great-grandmothers, you know, by these plantation owners, and that's how they wound up becoming part of the European heritage. It's just amazing to me that that show brings it up almost every week, connecting people. At one point there was and I forget who it was, a movie star on there, and she was very white. I believe it was a female, and she was related to Henry Louis Gates when they traced it back. It was just amazing.
Can I just toss in a quick comment about the the body cams and stuff. It's interesting. I saw someone post something on Facebook yesterday that showed the way that George Floyd's murder was reported in the police, and it was like there was like one line, like body cams were on. It was like the last on the entire time, and it was just this really disturbing and inaccurate sort of summary of what happened. And then thinking about this hope of the body cams, but like if that teenage girl had not taken that video and there was not another video, like what we think that the body cams show something, but like it was actually this girl's cell phone video that was so key. I'm sorry, that's kind of taking away from what you were saying, Tony. I apologize. It's taking us in a different direction.
In some ways it is related, because we look at images that we take with our cameras, with our phones. The whole idea is they freeze a moment in time. They record reality, which is one of the reasons why photography was so revolutionary when it was first developed, because as Christina already mentioned, up until that time, you just had paintings, and paintings were well known, and that was the whole point of them, was that, yeah, they recorded history, but they recorded the history the artist or the person who commissioned that painting wanted to see. It was not reality. Even portraits themselves, the sitters would say, oh, don't paint that wart, you know? So here all of a sudden we have technology that records reality as it is, but at the same time, yeah, it records it, but how we interpret that, how we use that image really affects what it can be done with it. And the body cams, the whole idea that, oh yes, the police are saying we are recording ourselves, and then at the same time, yeah, you've got that evidence in front of you, but how many of these police are exonerated for actions that they never should have done in the first place? And I know it's heat in the moment, and I can't speak to that because I've never been in a violent situation, but at the same time, when you have consistent offenders who are always get off or just have like a slap on the wrist, and despite the evidence in front of them, because his body cam may or may not have been on or what have you, it's like even with that visual evidence, you still have people interpreting it as something else. And and it's something that, yeah, it could really pertain to this book. So you're not really getting away from the conversation. Amber, would you like to say something as well?
Yeah, like in talking about how it was so accepted for the slaveholder to like have his own, like, you know, separate Black family and everything. And I just watched, it's still in print. It's a movie called The Feast of All Saints, and it's about that whole Placage tradition that would happen, like, I think specifically in New Orleans, where there would be these quadroon balls, and slaveholders would go to these balls to pick out which woman to have a separate family with. Like, it was so accepted. And, you know, just like, and these men were married, you know. So, yeah, it is interesting how, you know, yeah, just the male domination, just, you know, this is what, you know, men, particularly white men, want. And also, I thought it was so interesting, and it's on page 167, where I think there was a Northerner who was critiquing the South, and he was saying, like, you know, we are only mad with you slaveholders for making them white, saying that basically you're whitewashing them, or you're bleaching your slaves, like, you know. So I thought that was interesting. They were definitely alluding to sex. They were either alluding to rape. And I thought, oh my God, I thought that was so shocking for that time, for that to be brought up. It's interesting how people's writings, how, you know, dirty they could get. I don't want to call it dirty, but that really shocked me. So I'm done.
Oh, yeah, no, the dancing around the issue of what the slave owners were doing with their slaves, especially the sexual aspect of it, because rape was such a taboo subject, and it into a way that it is today as well. But especially within the Southern culture, where you had this very blatant system of consistent rape in families. And and to a point that really upset a lot of Northerners. But as you just mentioned in that one passage where they're calling it the bleaching of the colored race. And so it's like, I don't know, it's like you can read that two ways, where you can see like, yes, he's being very critical about what these men were doing to people that they owned, but also too, it could also be read as like this affront that you would change someone's racial background. And you're really kind of going out beyond those boundaries of like, this is white, this is black, you're brown, like that whole idea. So I found that a quote also very interesting. It's very, you could take it depending on how you're reading it different ways. But also too, the family's identity itself, I found really fascinating, especially at the end of the book, where she's talking about what happens to them after the fact, where you have Elizabeth and her husband, what is his name, Henry, you have them separating, and her taking the daughters who looked white off to a more affluent neighborhood where they could potentially find white marriage partners. And then he remained, but then even Elizabeth's own sister, who was also white, ended up marrying a black man, and then they were always identifying as black. And so like the family itself crossed these color boundaries frequently with I don't want to say great ease, because that really had to take something out of you psychologically speaking. But the back and forth of the family about how did they identify themselves? Did they identify as white? Did they identify as being a person of color? And I found that to be really fascinating, because it wasn't just an either or for them. They were able to cross those boundaries with a lot of fluidity in some ways. And I always felt bad for Mary's brother, Oscar, who ended up dying of tuberculosis at the age of 15. It's like, oh gosh, I really wanted to know like what would have happened if he had survived. That would have been a really interesting story as well.
And back to the comment on George Floyd, I think it's very connected, because the young lady that took the video, it was part of her humanity, and the other people watching, and taking videos, they were putting themselves into this situation because of their humanity. And I really still, back to this book, have a real problem with the humanity of the lawyer and the other people, because the way they treated the child, even though she was treated well and they had good intentions, the book just all through it made me feel uncomfortable, made me feel like it was almost mansplaining, white mansplaining. I know it helped, but I really had a problem with it, because I felt like, okay, you're criticizing these men for doing this, but what are you doing with this child? Are you being just as brutal in many ways, although you're taking care of her better? What are you doing to her psychologically?
It's almost like she was put on a, like a freak show type circuit, in terms of, look at this freak of nature kind of thing, and how do we, I don't know, it felt very much like very exploitive towards her. And I was also a little curious about, where were her parents when they were doing these tours? Like, she was on she was on stage, and then one of the white lawyers took her back to her families. Like, well, who was taking care? I mean, she's only 7. Who was taking care of her during the, while they were going from town to town for the meetings, so to speak? But that's kind of beside the point. I don't know. Or maybe it's more, more questions than answers kind of thing. But I was like, well, why are it was very exploitive towards her. She got to visit new places and maybe got to see things, and so maybe she didn't realize that it was, but I was wondering why her parents didn't think that it was. I don't know.
Well, yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, because it's like, I do appreciate how the author is explaining how messy it can get with allies, that they mean well, but then it's hard for them to put away their biases. Our biases are passed down. And so, yeah, I mean, it's like, how much of a choice did her parents really have, being Black parents? Oh, we're going to take your child. And I really felt for this author, because she said, I think she started this project when her son was born, or when she was pregnant, and then it was done, he was 7. So she worked like really, really hard trying to find this obscure information. For a long time, the picture of Mary, no one even knew who it was. And so she's trying to grab this information, but that's what I found really missing in the book. I mean, no fault of hers, but what was going on with this family, it just seems that they weren't seen as, was it consulted with the parents? Can we take her? It seems like it was kind of like, we're doing this, and maybe you should be grateful because we helped you, we helped you be free. So we're just going to do with her. And, what's the guy's name? Higginson, who wanted to adopt her. And he was one of many who were just like, oh, I'll take her. So, but, people not seeing like, no, she does have a family. Let me just figure out how I can adopt her, And that was one thing that the author had mentioned in one of her lectures. And she said, I think that was part of the reason that I think they moved. It was just, people just were like, I want to take her, and it was kind of like, wow. And they probably could take her, if they kept really trying, because what kind of power does a Black parent have over their kid? Even though they're free, they are Black. So, I just wish that we could have known more about how was the family feeling, and what was it like that they're at home and their child is just, out here. So it's just unfortunate that so much of that, that history and information is lost, So.
Yeah, I found that also a fascinating aspect as well, especially where in the introduction, I believe it is, the author bemoans the fact that she has no personal writings, no personal records of the family. She's totally basing this on legal records and what was written about them in the newspapers, and Charles Sumner and Higginson's own personal archive. So she's really trying to build this picture around information that is not personal to the little girl in the photograph. Mm-hmm. And I also found interesting the other daguerreotype in the book, where it shows Mary with her brother Oscar, and her position in that photograph compared to the one where it's just her and she's on display on her own is just so amazing. For her, she's like leaning against her brother. You can tell they were very close with each other, and it really made me wish that someone had taken a picture of the entire family together and showing them as a unit, and that just didn't happen. And in some ways, I kind of wonder if that picture with Oscar was taken just to show how different colored she was from her own brother.
Right.
So it's like what was the intent of that image?
I think that the author did say, I think that was like just a family picture. It wasn't it was just something for the family to see. And so, and she like you said, how different it was, so how sympathetic would they be to this white child if they had seen her? Obviously, she loves her brother, her darker brother. But it was just, it was a personal, I think, family picture. It wasn't meant for public use, like, of course, the other one was. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I love that picture. I adore that picture. So cute.
Yeah, it's Amy, a great image.
Well, I was just going to say, it's interesting in a conversation of overall oppression that we're talking, and we're bringing our sensibility to the child's right not to be exploited. But so I just as a tiny bit of background, I started my professional career as a child advocate, and child's rights wasn't even a thing until the 1900s. So she, as a human being, wasn't even recognized as a human being, but as property of her parents. So we bring our sensibility that, oh no, this 7-year-old child was exploited. And yes, that was hard to read, don't get me wrong. But they wouldn't have seen it that way in the time. She wouldn't have had the rights that we assume that she has, to any of the liberties that we assume that she has, because they would not have assumed that, you know, in the historical context. So it's just kind of another layer of all the different layers of oppression that kind of occur in her scenario. So I kind of, that hit me. Like, that hit me like a ton of bricks hit me, but I just wanted to share that tiny piece.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Amy. And again, it, as you said, it really does kind of highlight this whole fact where we're reading this as people of the 21st century. And this, all these events happen in the mid 19th century, which was a completely different culture that, yeah, we can try to understand it, but we're never going to be able to fully understand exactly what was going on at that time. And people were looking at the world in a very different way than how we look at it today. I would like to say that's an improvement, but it's, we're more willing to look at and try to understand things that were not understood, or people didn't try to make connections that they were making. Like, some were making it, but not fully, or to the extent that I would say that we're trying to do today. Very much we're work in progress. Yes. And I'm sorry, were you trying to say something, Kelly?
Oh, I was just going to apologize for my earlier comment about the photograph working. I think that I feel like that I'm sitting in a van watching this game while I'm also here. And I think this photograph is super problematic, and I apologize for the way that came out. And I don't even know that it's worth explaining what I meant by that, but just that within the discourses that were going at that time, he anticipated that the photograph would be read a certain way, and it is really what I meant. And I just wanted to share that.
One of the things that bothers me, and is that there's always been humanity. There's always been people in the culture that had a different view of humans, of children, and they just weren't the mainstream. And it reminds us of how we can be led into beliefs and things like a herd, almost, with this herd mentality that we just go along with the rest.
I think we would like to think our culture now is so different, and I think maybe in some ways it is, and yet I don't know. It's frustrating to think about the images that have cachet now and how they're circulating now and how they reveal certainly our own biases and prejudices the same way that the images that took root and worked then did the same. That's something I just find myself thinking about.
Yeah, actually, I was, last night, I was with a group of my friends with another book club that I'm involved in, and totally not in discussion with because we were reading Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, and from that we got onto the whole issue of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, and how Meghan herself is perceived in the British press versus oh, I'm totally blanking on her name.
the other wife.
Yes,
Kate
Middleton. Kate Middleton, thank you. Yes, and how, like, you can have a side-by-side picture of both of them being pregnant and embracing their in utero babies, and how with Kate it's a protective gesture, but with Meghan they describe it as her showing off her pregnancy, and it's literally the exact same position that they're holding. and so there's this whole idea where we're like, oh, and England especially always likes to say, oh, we got rid of slavery so much earlier before you, and they kind of hold it over us. But at the same time, they had colonies where they're exploiting people and like totally ignoring everything they did in the Caribbean on the sugar plantations. But I mean, but even then, like you're still seeing this, like, I don't think the journalists are 100% aware that they're doing it when they're writing these comments between Kate and Meghan, where you're just like, oh my God, do you not see what you're saying?
I feel like a really related case of that was that boy the Stanford swimmer who was accused of rape and do you know what I'm talking about? And the photograph that accompanied all of this press about him, first of all, they positioned him as a swimmer rather than talking about this, you know, the fact that he raped this woman while she was drunk coming home from a party and then was pulled off of her by two bystanders. And that woman now has a book out that she was anonymous for a long time. And then it's something about knowing her name.
Yeah, I think it is titled Know My Name.
Know My Name.
And actually the guy, the rapist of that situation, because that was here in Ohio, apparently is
once again
to Cincinnati.
Ohio in the news.
Yes. But yeah, so he's living here in Cincinnati, and I know a couple of bartenders where like he comes in and they refuse to serve him. We're like, no, we're not having anything to do with you, because yeah, even in his own trial, the judges were like, oh yeah, you made a mistake, but we're not going to let it affect the rest of your life. It was like, I'm sorry, no, that was an intentional decision that you chose to do to a woman. And then actually I think it was two foreign exchange students who had to pull him off of the girl.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, it's like that whole situation where you're just like, oh my God, could this get any worse?
Yeah, but the picture was of this very nice. It was not his picture whenever he was taken into custody, you know. And I just think it's frustrating. You wouldn't think that the picture is politicized, but it is, and it's playing on biases and it's being used, you know, whether or not there's a Sumner who's saying like, oh, this will speak louder than a speech, like it's still impacting audiences and stuff.
Yeah, it is interesting to see people who get accused of a crime is like who gets their mugshot shown and who gets the family photo.
Yeah.
And I wish that we just had a rule where we just show the mugshots if we're going to try to do that, or else at least show maybe a mugshot and a family photo of each one. I mean, I don't know. It's like the situations, like some of these crimes that these men are perpetuating, and you're like, oh yes, but let's paint them as a family man, where you're just kind of like, really? That's the conversation you want to have right now? And again, it really is like where you have an image that speaks a lot louder than words in a lot of ways, and we've become a very, very visual culture with even the last 20 years, since everyone does now have cell phones, and you know, you've got social media where a lot of social media is image based. I mean, look at like TikTok and Snapchat and all these other platforms that my younger cousins are on, and I'm just like, how do you even like have a serious conversation about what's important in life when it's literally, oh, let me take a picture of myself where I'm showing off what I'm doing. But so there's this whole concept of a visual reality now that I don't know if that truly existed or could have existed in the past.
Yeah, well, what I do appreciate about this book, like how she said how the picture it was unknown who this girl was for a long time. And it's just like, wow, I guess it makes sense that to make the anti-slavery movement more palatable, they had to use a white-looking child. Like, you know, would they just use a Black girl? Like, who's going to care, right? And then they say that even now, this one guy, this white guy I know of in Pittsburgh, he wanted to adopt some kids, and they just kept showing him pictures of these white children. And he said, you know, he told them, he said, well, no disrespect, but are there any other kinds of books with, you know, different types of kids? And they said, oh, Black kids don't get adopted. So, you know, so it's like there's still this bias, like, you know, just the lighter, the better. And so it's like for this anti-slavery movement to get the sympathy, they definitely had to, should I say they had to, but, you know, to make it palatable to a lot of white people, even though they may have meant well, they still had that bias of light skin versus dark skin and preferring light skin. And that even, of course, bled over into the Black community, where there's this writer named Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, I think is her whole name. And she was getting concerned that when slavery was over, maybe perhaps in the late 1800s, early 1900s, she noticed that like her children or grandchildren knew nothing about slavery. And this was just a few decades afterwards. They had no idea about slavery. And so she said her purpose of writing her book, Iola Leroy, the purpose of that book was to show future generations how it was for slaves. Iola Leroy is a very light-skinned woman. And so it's like, I think again, you know, would the book have been published if she had just used a regular Black woman, right? So, you know, to make it palatable, to sell it, and even palatable to Black people, a lot of Black people at that time, you know. So I just think, you know, it's so unfortunate to see that you had to make the character light when you're talking about slavery, you know. So yeah, you know, the bias, you know, it just goes to show how deeply ingrained and how it, you know, bleeds into all different groups in our society, not just the white people, for sure.
Right. And, you know, Harriet Beecher Stowe falls into that trap as well when she, you know, the main character who's, you know, freedom seeking, the main character who's leaving being enslaved and going to Canada, Eliza Harris, is depicted as a very light-skinned woman, and, you know, she could pass as white, you know, kind of things that gets talked about.
Yeah, she got called out for that too.
And it really comes back to the fact that, you know, she wanted her northern white women readers to feel empathy and sympathy for this character. And so how do you do that? You make her as white as possible. Now it becomes interesting because all of the pictures of Eliza, you know, there's hundreds of drawings of Eliza, and, you know, you see a colorized drawing of Eliza and she looks light skinned, or in some cases almost white herself. And then you have, you know, 7, 8-year-old kids on a tour saying, why does she look white? So you have to delicately explain in some way, you know, well, no, sometimes today there are African Americans who have very light skin. Well, that's the same way it was back in the old days. And, you know, you have to, depending on the age of the kids, you know, by the time they're in junior high, you can explain it more realistically. But for little kids, it's like their parents are like, how much information can I give, kind of thing. Yeah. But it's the reality of what has happened. You know, you don't want to not talk about what has happened. All right, sorry.
Well, no, and actually we say that, and I think, doesn't Eliza's husband George pass as white while he's escaping? I mean,
yeah. Well, yeah, he's like a Spanish gentleman.
Yeah, but and then like the only the only like true like major Black characters in the book is Uncle Tom, and I find the depictions of Uncle Tom, even from the very first edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin, to be absolutely fascinating, because you have that one key scene where he's sitting with little Eva St. Clair, and it's like this key scene, and that got, oh my God, the images of Eva and Uncle Tom, that was like the key thing that was reproduced as a visual image out of the book in multiple lines, and you talk about it a little bit in the book, where you have Henry, Mary's father, actually gives Rousseau a little statue of Uncle Tom holding little Eva St. Clair, and that was produced by an English ceramic factory. But then if you look at actual illustrations that came out with the book in the first edition, that scene where you have a 40-year-old man holding this girl on his lap. They turned Uncle Tom into an old man because you couldn't have a Black guy in the prime of his life holding this blonde child who was literally written as like this angelic paragon of a girl. And I've only been able to find one instance that tries to realistically depict this scene, and it was painted by Robert Duncanson, who himself was a Black artist. And he was commissioned to do this painting. It's now at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And so he's the one who actually painted Uncle Tom as a man in his 40s with this girl, where he was just true to the scene. And that's the only version I can find. So you like we're still, you still see this happening. And it's really kind of horrific. And also too, what Amber was saying earlier about the lighter skin, even within the Black community, being something. My sister a few years ago went to Africa and was in Uganda, and my sister is very dramatic looking with blonde hair, and she's very tall, she's very pale, and she was traveling with another girl who was also blonde, and they decided to save some money by actually traveling by bus through the country, as opposed to just getting on the train and like hopping from one place to another place, which is apparently what a lot of white tourists do when they're in Uganda. And so she was in this village, and as they're walking down this village with their tour guide, all of a sudden these kids come up and start holding onto their hands. And Elizabeth thought, oh, this is such a beautiful moment. I'm connecting with these children. And then she finds out that the children were holding her hand in the hopes that her whiteness would rub off onto them. And so to think that young children today are being taught this ideology, and also in terms of their own color and their own, how people perceive them, it's heartbreaking to think that. But again, yeah, it does really kind of speak to like, what is the ideal within any person, or visual ideal, or and it changes so often, and it's a very sticky kind of topic because it's hard to really discuss it honestly and try to think about why this is, which is kind of off topic, but not really.
Well, two things, and I don't even know how much time we have, but I couldn't believe that she had found that evidence of the 15-year-old white girl getting pregnant by that 50-year-old slave, Juba. I couldn't believe she had actually found evidence of that, and how the woman even admitted, like she had to admit in court. And that was something that was just interesting too, with these court documents and how they were describing these people. She's almost white. She's so fair. She looks white, whatever. But I thought that was really, really interesting that that man was even still able to live. And they talked about that. But that is what you rarely hear about. Of course, we know about the white male, Black female experience, but you hardly hear about the reverse. And I was so shocked that she had found that. And then another thing is just with Mary at the end of her life, or just, when she became an adult, and how they talked about how she lived, like was she possibly a lesbian?
Yeah.
And then they mentioned how Higginson, how he could have meaning well, but he could have possibly outed her, because he wrote later in his autobiography how he had helped a girl that that looked white, and it was just like, oh God, please be quiet, because of course she was living like a white woman, but so again, people not knowing what harm they can do, meaning well, but not really. So just some other interesting things in the book I like.
Yeah, for a book this size, it seems very short to have covered so many fascinating subjects, and it's almost like a tip of the iceberg. I mean, you feel like you could do a whole entire class on this book and the subjects it brings up and the topics. And yeah, for, what is it? It's, how long is this book? That's the acknowledgements. Hold on. It is
about 270 pages of actual writing.
Yeah. 278. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So for considering, I mean, we've been discussing this book now for an hour and 11 minutes, and we still feel like we can keep on going. I mean, but yeah, so there's a lot that's going on in this little book where there's definitely more to be explored.
Well, you do not have to end right now. You can keep going a little bit, but I have to go do a couple things in the house before our next tour. So you keep talking for as long as you want. I will just leave this on and I will come back and click it off later. But thank you all for the discussion today, and I will let Anne kind of take over if there's more stuff that you guys want to talk about before you leave.
Okay. All right.
Well, I need to leave also, ladies. I've enjoyed the discussion and I look forward to reading the book. Thanks.
Well, thank you for joining us, Marty.
Okay, bye-bye.
So thanks for having me. I'm also going to jump off the Heritage Village Museum event today.
Oh, okay. All right.
So, in Sharonville. So thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, but the whole idea of the white savior coming in, that seemed to be like a key theme throughout the book. Whereas like Higginson especially, I mean, we find him to be this almost repugnant man today, because like he's almost seems like, oh, I'm trying to be like, I'm like the best person ever because I'm doing all these things for these Black people, but at the same time he's really kind of like, but look at how great I am, I'm this awesome person. And yes, like whenever Higginson was brought up, and I felt this way in other things I've read about Higginson, where you're like, he toots his own horn a little too much. and it was something that I've seen in other history books where they're talking about him, and even when they're not talking about him in that way, it's like what the man's own words are saying about him. You just want to be like, oh God, just shut up and go away. Amy, you have your hand up.
So I have a question which relates to the book, but also to the anthropology, I think. So, and I haven't like formed this whole thought out, so bear with me while I talk it out. But I was thinking back, Anne, to when you were talking about how younger generations are doing the TikTok and the Snapchat videos. And regarding George Floyd, like they said that young lady's video was instrumental in the verdict. Without it, it would have been an entirely different verdict. And even Micaiah up in Columbus, like without the videos, even though they're still doing their investigation, like we see it in real time. And I wonder if there's something in our brains that processes that video and the visual imagery rather than hearing the stories, if that makes sense. Because like, I kept thinking while we were talking today about how language sort of stemmed from pictograms to begin with, which it seems like visuals were the first way people communicated. And I just wonder if that's why these things have such impact. Because you can hear it, but when you see a man laying there with somebody's knee on their neck, or you see, somebody getting shot, and you see those visuals, even though the images can be manipulated, even though they can be edited and they can be cropped and they can be cut and they can be politicized, to actually see it seems to have a totally different impact than just hearing about it or reading about it. Does that make sense?
No, it totally makes sense. Because we do process things on a very visual level. I mean, you can think about going to churches in Europe where you are, the stained glass windows were used as stories for the parishioners who were coming in who were illiterate, who had no way to read the Bible, or they weren't even supposed to be reading the Bible themselves to interpret, and they were using the windows as illustrations to biblical stories to give them this idea of this is what's going on. And so in a way, as a humanity, we have always used visuals to bring a point across in some way, shape, or form. whether it's a stained glass window, an illustration, a painting, and now of course we have photography, which makes it in some ways far more immediate than an actual constructed image is. Of course, as we know, photographs can also be manipulated. So it's kind of hard to really say, oh yes, that's the end all be all in terms of visual imagery. Tony, you have wanted to.
Well, I think it's like the theater. If you think about it, if you listen to a play online or on the radio, it's not quite the same as watching it live and in person, or even watching it with visuals. It's very different. But to your point, you know, you can alter both. And we see that in times of trauma, you can't really set the image as well, but you know, you can alter both, just like with the police wearing body cams, depending on the angle they're standing at, it makes a difference in what you see.
Yes, it very much does. And also too, I mean, you think about what Christina was saying earlier about Matthew Brady bringing the war to the people. And then it also kind of made me think about the images of the Vietnam War that were being broadcast on the nightly news, where people are watching the news with their families together. And all of a sudden these images of what war truly is being pushed into their faces front and center. And we still see that, like you've mentioned, with the videos of George Floyd, with the actual videos of people being shot, where you're seeing this slice of what's going on being brought to you. And in some ways it's more immediate because it's showing up on your phones, it's showing up on pieces of equipment and technology that you carry in your pocket, or you are constantly looking at like on your computer for work or something. It's like, so you almost can't get away from it. But yeah, so there is this immediacy that comes out of it that really just makes it a very visceral thing to see and view.
Well, and also just slightly off topic, but regarding daguerreotypes, I used to work in the public library down at Maine, where there's one of the large daguerreotypes of the city. And one of the things that's fascinating is they blew it up and manipulated the photo. And there's actually more depicted in the photo, in the image, than you can tell, because when they set up the stills to make the 8 planes for the daguerreotype mural, they were stopped in time. But when you blow it up, you can see people's laundry on the line. You can see people standing on the riverboats. You can see, the laundry is hilarious because it's kind of blowing in the wind. So somebody's drawers are out there for posterity. You can also see the clock in the church, where when the hands are kind of blurry. But yeah, so to know what the imagery or what imagery and technology they had in the 1800s is fascinating when you compare it to what we've got now. Just a teeny tiny piece on that. And it's really cool to like blow it up.
Oh yeah, no, and we actually use a section of that photograph on one of our panels at the Stowe House this is an example of what Cincinnati looked like a few years after the Beecher family moved to Cincinnati. So I'm very familiar with that photograph as well. And then I love taking family members who are in town, like, oh, let's go over to the little public library, to the Cincinnati room, and let me show you this great thing. Yeah. Yeah, it's a wonderful image, and especially how they have it set up where you can touch the touch screen below it, and it does like zoom in on the image for you, and you can see all those wonderful details, just like life frozen for a moment in Cincinnati. But yeah, I do feel whoever's drawers that is hanging up on the wash line for all posterity. Okay, let's see here. I'm trying to think if there's anything else we can say in relation to the actual book that we haven't kind of talked about already. I mean, I will say I found this book in a rather interesting place. I was at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's house. And I found this book, I first discovered it in the gift shop in Monticello, where I've never seen it in any other bookstore. unless I've had to actually go out and order it myself. And I discovered this in the section at the bookstore where they have all the books about Sally Jennings and her family and all the literature that's come out about it. And someone had ordered this book and tucked it in the shelves amongst all those books. And I just kind of, it was like this little unfound, unknown treasure and tucked in amongst all the Sally books, which I personally found rather interesting.
That's an interesting place for it to be.
Yeah. And to think that I've never seen it anywhere else. When I first brought this book to Christina's attention, she'd never heard of it either. I'm not sure how much this book was actually advertised when it first came out.
I found it on Overdrive, so somebody has it on digitized on the Overdrive platform.
And it's also available on Libby as well.
It's the same platform, but yes.
Oh yeah, is it? Okay, yeah, where you're just kind of like, yeah, but I mean, if you didn't know about that book, would you have been really able to have found it on Overdrive? Like, I know it's great they made it available, but you have to know something to search for it in a way. And I kind of miss that about walking into the actual library and just looking at the shelves being like, oh, that looks interesting, where you wouldn't normally have picked it up. And you don't have that option when you're downloading books online, unfortunately. I do miss that.
And the book Item A, that was the first time I'd really heard about that. Is that readily available?
It, you might be, well, she does talk about, I think in her bibliography about it, where she actually found and bought a copy of it herself for rather cheap from someone. But then I think she does say that it is available as a digital, on a digital platform somewhere.
Oh, okay. Because I use Libby, so I have to go, because I'm interested to read that book too.
Yeah, Libby is the hipper version of Overdrive. Overdrive is called the classic, and Libby is the more updated version.
I was going to ask, like, what do people like better? I use Overdrive.
I love Libby. I use Libby.
I use Overdrive.
Libby's very easy.
But the idea was that Libby is the newer version of Overdrive, so.
Yeah, because I had Overdrive on my phone, and then it stopped working, and then I had to go and download Libby from the library's website. But it's interesting that it's actually still Overdrive, but just with a new name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just Overdrive with a new name. But there are some, and I'm sorry, I should know them. But I think with Libby, there's something you cannot do, like you can't save your history or something, which you can do on Overdrive. I think that's just different. There's like some small tweaks. So like for me, I like to keep track of my history. So if that's important to you, you might not want to switch them.
That's interesting.
Something like that. I just can't remember what exactly it is. But yeah, it's essentially exactly the same thing. If you look closely, it's Libby operated by Overdrive.
I think I've seen that, yeah.
Interesting. Oh, Tony, in answer to your question about Item A, so on page 281 at the very end, she talks about trying to find Item A when she was doing her research. So she had a request to order a copy through an interlibrary loan, and then she says in parentheses, it has since been placed online. She doesn't say where.
Okay.
Then also,
well, I'll try.
She herself put out a new edition of the novel Item A.
Oh.
Where apparently she has an additional appendix in that book that includes all the 19th century reviews she discovered while doing the research for this book.
Oh, good.
So that would actually be interesting to find that edition.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's available. Worth looking for.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you chose this book. I don't know that I otherwise would have found it or read it, but what I've read so far has been enjoyable.
Yeah, it when I first picked up the book, I wasn't really sure what to expect from it. And so in some ways I was kind of pleasantly surprised that it is this wonderful, weird story and history that unfortunately is still relevant today in a lot of ways. And yeah, it's just kind of like really interesting. I actually made all my friends read it in our other book club that we're doing as well, and they weren't too thrilled about having to read a nonfiction, but I felt it was something they should know about. Yeah.
I get that. I'm in a few other books, like the Mercantile Library has some discussion groups, and there's some others elsewhere, and those are almost exclusively fiction, which I personally enjoy, like the other people in your book club, but I find it fun to kind of take a break from that and do the nonfiction that we've been doing through the Semicolon Club as well. Kind of a refreshing break, as you will.
Yeah, I have to say, I tend to read more nonfiction than I do fiction, and so it's usually my friends are like, no, you should read that. And it doesn't always work in the other way around, unfortunately. Yeah, no. Well, actually, I need to be somewhere. I am so excited. I'm taking my 4-month-old niece for her first time to the Cincinnati Art Museum this afternoon. Yes, and so that's happening at 2 o'clock, so I should probably sign off so I can go and meet my brother and his little daughter at the museum. But I want to thank you all so much for joining us, for taking the time to read the book, and this was such a wonderful and great discussion that we were able to have in this hour and a half, which again is not long enough to really truly discuss this. So thank you so much for joining us.
For moderating.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Have fun.